Notes from the Intelligence and National Security Summit, especially about cyber conflict with nation-states and terrorist organizations, unresolved issues of cyber deterrence, and where it should fall on the spectrum of conflict, goals of election hacking and other influence operations, ransomware trends and credential breaches, and sometimes your enemies are an even better recommendation than your friends. Time to take a moment to tell you about our sponsor, Recorded Future. If you haven't already done so, take a look at Recorded Future's Cyber Daily. We look at it. The CyberWire staff subscribes and consults it daily. The web is rich with indicators and warnings, but it's nearly impossible to collect them by eyeballing the internet by yourself, no matter how many analysts you might have on staff. And we're betting that however many you haven't got enough. Recorded Future does the hard work for you by automatically collecting and organizing the entire web to identify new vulnerabilities and emerging threat indicators. Sign up for the Cyber Daily email to get the top trending technical indicators crossing the web: cyber news, targeted industries, threat actors, exploited vulnerabilities, malware, and suspicious IP addresses. Subscribe today and stay ahead of the cyber attacks. Go to recordedfuture.com/intel to subscribe for free threat intelligence updates from Recorded Future. That's recordedfuture.com/intel. And we thank Recorded Future for sponsoring our show. I'm Dave Bittner in Baltimore with your CyberWire summary for Monday, September 12, 2016. Last week's Intelligence and National Security Summit offered a great deal on cybersecurity policy and practice. Cyber was not only addressed repeatedly in the plenary sessions, but it was the focus of one of the conference's 3 breakout tracks. That cyberspace is of prime concern to the intelligence community, and those who support it is unsurprising, but a walk through the exhibitors hall offered some striking confirmation. Cybersecurity vendors dominated the space. Also interesting was the clear sense that the leaders INSA and AFCEA drew to the summit were working through some of the same theoretical, practical, and conceptual issues defense thinkers have grappled with over the past century and a half. How those issues will be resolved in cyberspace is in some cases clear. Elsewhere, it remains murky. Questions of deterrence were particularly difficult to resolve. Several of the symposiists suggest that cyber deterrence today was in roughly the same state of theoretical immaturity nuclear deterrence was in 1950. How to balance the need for certain attribution and credible retribution on the one hand, with the competing need for freedom of action and desirable ambiguity in particular, remains an unsolved challenge. The international norms we find in such places as the law of armed conflict are also still missing from cyber conflict. The entire field remains to be developed. Couple with this an observation made by Lieutenant General Kevin McLaughlin, Deputy Commander, U.S. Cyber Command, to the effect that cyber attacks need not be met with retaliation in kind, and it's clear that the relationship between the virtual and the kinetic worlds remains, to say the least, imperfectly understood. For a full account of the summit, visit our website, thecyberwire.com. The summit was hosted by AFCEA International and the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, INSA. Among the topics taken up at the summit was the threat posed by nation-states, Russia prominently among them, and by non-national actors, especially the Islamic State. The Islamic State, that is ISIS, may be on the way to defeat. That's the assessment of Director of Central Intelligence Brennan and his colleagues in the Big Six U.S. intelligence agencies, especially insofar as ISIS aspires to be a caliphate holding, governing, and administering territory. But Brennan and his colleagues don't regard this as unalloyed good news. They expect to see a decline in ISIS cyber and information operations capability as it loses the relatively secure enclaves it finds useful in producing what FBI Director Comey called, quote, the kind of propaganda they use to influence screwed-up individuals, end quote. But they anticipate problems as well, expecting a metastasis of fighters to spread to other regions as ISIS loses control over its core territory. There are reports today that law enforcement and intelligence agencies find ISIS an increasingly elusive opponent online, less easy to track and trail than it formerly was. This is in part due to ISIS's increasing use of encrypted chat, but to a great extent, as the Wall Street Journal reports, it's attributable to the caliphate's reversion to the traditional terrorist cellular tradecraft, face-to-face meetings, written notes, and misdirection. Sometimes one advances capabilities by technological retreat. The other class of threat that received a great deal of attention at last week's meeting was, of course, the nation-state threat. Here, 4 states were singled out as particularly troublesome: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Australian authorities see a rising threat of foreign cyber attacks aimed at eroding that country's government's legitimacy and the credibility of its political leaders. Chinese efforts here pose the most immediate concern, although Russia is mentioned as well. Chinese influence operations appear mostly economically motivated, and to extend such things as traditional lobbying shading toward bribery. U.S. concerns about Chinese cyber operations have less to do with fear of influence than they do with ongoing incidents of direct hacking aimed at theft of intellectual property. Yet here, the experts at the Intelligence and National Security Summit were in substantial agreement. The cyber tensions with China can be and are being managed through diplomacy and negotiation. Matters stand quite differently with Russia. Here the concern is more serious, as Russia shows a strong capability and willingness to wage hybrid warfare. Both the President and the Secretary of Defense have warned Russia about interfering with U.S. political processes, and last week's symposiists agreed there was a threat there. Director of Central Intelligence Brennan declined over the weekend to say that Russia was hacking the elections, but he did counsel wariness over Russia's cyber capabilities, which he assessed as high. Observers are arriving at a consensus that manipulating U.S. election results globally would be difficult, although local mischief remains a real concern. The dispersed and disparate nature of the state-run U.S. electoral process is, by virtue of what FBI Director Comey last Thursday called its clunkiness, relatively resistant to large-scale manipulation. But such large-scale manipulation is thought unlikely to be Russia's goal. As The Hill noted this morning, the goal is not to change the results of November's elections, but rather to call them into question, thereby undermining confidence in American democracy. In cybercrime notes, as ransomware continues to morph and spread, researchers at Trend Labs find the CryLocker ransomware exfiltrating user information as a PNG file. Another big credential breach hits, this one involving Russian instant messaging service QIP.ru. It's thought to affect 33 million users. As President Obama nears the end of his second term, the American Civil Liberties Union has opened a campaign advocating a presidential pardon for NSA leaker Edward Snowden. This Wednesday, the ACLU is expected to join Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch in opening a petition to that effect. They hope to take advantage of the attention generated by the opening of Oliver Stone's film Snowden. Appropriately enough, the petition will be conducted online. Finally, we've on a few occasions been able to shout bravo in the direction of MSISoft's Fabian Vosar, who's released several ransomware decryption tools. Recently, he's received accolades of another kind. The Apocalypse Criminal Coding Group has named a strain of ransomware after him, Fabian Ansomware. We hear it's poorly designed. In any case, bravo, Fabian, and keep slugging. Sometimes your best recommendation is the enemies you make. Time to take a moment to thank our sponsor, E8 Security. You know, to handle the unknown threats, you need the right analytics to see them coming. Consider the insider threat, and remember that an insider threat isn't necessarily a malicious actor. Sometimes it's a well-intentioned person who's careless, compromised, or just poorly trained. Did you know you can learn user behavior and score a user's risk? E8 can show you how. Did you know, for example, that multiple Kerberos tickets granted to a single user is a tip-off to a compromise? E8 can show you why. Get the white paper at e8security.com/DHR and get started. Detect, hunt, respond. E8 Security. And we thank E8 for sponsoring our show. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Yisroel Mirsky. He's a PhD candidate, researcher, and project manager at the Cybersecurity Research Center at Ben Gurion University. Thanks for joining us today. I know one of the things you wanted to talk to us about, one of the areas of your research, is air gap security.
So air gap security is a security measure in which an organization physically isolates their network from public networks in order to evade attacks, or really to evade direct confrontation. So, for example, military networks or financial systems, and most commonly industrial systems such as power plants. Although it's a great measure and it really does help minimize the attack vectors on the organization's network, is not impervious to attacks. For example, there are many malwares out there that can get over this air gap, this physical separation between the two networks. For example, Flame, Gauss, Agent BTZ, Stuxnet, and so on and so forth. So when it comes down to it, the attacker's challenge is two factors. One, command and control of his malware. Once he's gotten into the network, how can he control his malware to get to whatever asset he has? And data exfiltration. As soon as he gets whatever data or asset he wants, how can he get it out of the network? And in general, there are two types of channels that the attack would be interested in, like I mentioned before, an inbound channel and an outbound channel from the network. So for an inbound channel, there's one approach, which is actually quite interesting, is the idea that not every network is completely isolated from all other networks. For example, most buildings have what's called an HVAC system, a heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. And this system will change the heating and will also allow you to control all sorts of other subsystems such as elevators, but many times has a web portal for the technicians to connect to and administer the system from remote. Now, this web portal will connect to the public internet, but in parallel, in the same physical space, you have this isolated network. So what we found is that if you compromise the HVAC system from remote, you can raise the temperature and lower the temperature of the different rooms, and thus signal binary modulations over the air to the computers, because every computer has basically thermal sensors inside for the CPU and for the chassis and so on and so forth. And you can actually detect these fluctuations quite well. So it just goes to show that you may be able to segregate your network completely, physically, and isolate it, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be, impervious from attacks. You have to think of all sorts of other outside-the-box kind of attacks and side channels that can be affected.
Yisroel Mirsky, thanks for joining us. And that's the CyberWire. For links to all of today's stories, along with interviews, our glossary, and more, visit thecyberwire.com. Thanks to all of our sponsors who make the CyberWire possible. The CyberWire podcast is produced by Pratt Street Media. The editor is John Petrick. Our social media editor is Jennifer Iben. And our technical editor is Chris Russell. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpie. And I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.